The youngest member of Glen Hansard's family was not inside St. Patrick's Cathedral when Ireland gathered to say goodbye. His name is Christy. He is 3 years old. The decision to keep him away from the service was understandable. A cathedral filled with grieving adults, television cameras, unfamiliar faces, and hours of speeches would have been difficult for such a small child to comprehend. He was too young to understand why so many people had gathered, or why his father was not coming home. Still, Christy was present in another way. On top of Glen's wicker coffin rested a family photograph. Máire Saaritsa was holding their baby, while Glen stood nearby looking toward them. It was not an image from a concert or an awards ceremony. Glen was not holding the Oscar that had carried his name around the world. There were no stage lights and no audience waiting for him to sing. It was simply a photograph of a father watching his family. Another picture showed Glen with his late mother, Catherine. Between those two images sat much of his private life, the woman who raised him and the child he had only recently begun raising. Outside the cathedral, crowds gathered behind barriers and watched the service on large screens. Inside, the number of seats was limited. Friends, relatives, and musicians from different periods of Glen's life filled the old church. Bono arrived with The Edge. Eddie Vedder was there. Marketa Irglova, Hozier, Imelda May, and members of the Frames joined the mourners. Their presence drew attention, but the quiet family photograph told the more personal story. Most of the people inside that cathedral had known Glen as an adult. They remembered conversations, concerts, arguments, journeys, and late nights spent playing music. Christy had only known him as his father. At 3, his memories were still being formed. Small things that adults rarely think to preserve may have mattered most. The sound of a key in the door, footsteps coming down a hallway, the way Glen lifted him into his arms or spoke to him when nobody else was listening. Those private moments could not be shown on the screens outside. As the service continued, people performed songs and spoke about Glen's generosity. They remembered the musician who could command a crowded room and the friend who often appeared when someone needed help. But sitting above the coffin was evidence of a much newer part of his life. Fatherhood had arrived late for Glen. It had also become deeply important to him. That part of the story had not belonged to the public in the same way as his music. It belonged to Máire and Christy. Then Máire stood to speak. She carried pages in her hands and tried to steady herself before the people gathered in front of her. She thanked those who had supported the family during the worst days of their lives. She spoke about the man she loved and the home they had created. And when she began talking about their little boy, the meaning of that photograph became painfully clear. Máire Saaritsa did not walk to the altar quickly. She had just embraced Glen's younger brother Richard after his tribute. For several moments, she held him tightly. Then she released him, gathered herself, and began the slow walk toward the place where she would speak. There was no way to make the moment easier. Máire is a poet. Words had long been part of her life, just as songs had been part of Glen's. But standing inside St. Patrick's Cathedral, she was not addressing an audience at a reading. She was speaking as a wife whose ordinary life had changed without warning. The pages in her hands could not protect her from that. She began by thanking the Gardaí and the emergency workers who had gone to Glen's aid. She spoke of the humanity they had shown her during what she called her most desperate hour. Máire did not publicly describe every detail of that hour. She did not say where she was when she learned what had happened, or explain what words were used when the news reached her. Those moments remained private. Her gratitude, however, revealed something about the condition in which strangers had first encountered her. This was not grief that had arrived gradually after months of preparation. There had been no time to understand it before decisions had to be made. Relatives had to be contacted, and a 3-year-old child still needed to be cared for. She also thanked the many people who had supported the family during the days that followed. Máire said she could not find an adjective large enough for the kindness they had received. She believed the right word could be seen in people's eyes, and in the things they had quietly done. Then she turned toward the life she had shared with Glen. She thanked him for the years they had spent searching for beauty and truth beside one another. It sounded like the language of two artists, but she did not leave the thought in the world of poetry. She said they had found that beauty in Christy. Their son was too young to be inside the cathedral. He was also too young, Máire explained, to understand the enormity of what had happened during the previous days. At 3 years old, death does not arrive as an idea that can be neatly explained. A child understands routines. He notices that someone has stopped walking through the door. He waits for a familiar voice. He may ask the same question again, because the first answer does not yet make sense. Máire did not pretend that Christy understood the funeral taking place without him. Instead, she spoke about what remained. She said the bright spirit he had inherited from Glen was still with them. It was a careful statement from a mother facing two forms of grief at once. She had lost her husband, but she also had to carry the beginning of her son's loss until he became old enough to understand it himself. Near the end of her tribute, Máire offered Glen something deeply personal. She read a poem she had written for him, describing it as a small return for the many songs he had written for her. For years, Glen had been the one who placed private feelings into music. On that afternoon, Máire had to find the words, and somewhere beyond the cathedral, their little boy remained at the center of every one of them. When Richard Hansard stood to speak about his brother, he began by setting the famous versions of Glen aside. There was Glen, the musician, Glen from the Frames, Glen the band leader, the friend, and the person who seemed to connect people who might otherwise never have met. But Richard wanted the cathedral to remember who Glen had been before any of that. He had been a son, a brother, an uncle, and, for Richard, something close to a father. There were 16 years between Glen and his younger brothers, Richard and Dylan. That difference mattered when they were children. Glen was old enough to have already seen more of the world, but still young enough to sit with them, tell stories, and understand the things that frightened or confused them. Richard remembered how Glen could enter a room and change the evening. He might bring a song with him. He might tell a story. He might simply sit down and begin asking questions. According to Richard, Glen did not listen politely while waiting for his own chance to speak. He wanted to understand what was really happening beneath the ordinary answer. He wanted to know about weaknesses, worries, and struggles. For a shy boy growing up in North Dublin, that attention had an effect. Richard said Glen made the world appear more magical than it had seemed before he arrived. It became easier to imagine a larger life, because his older brother was already showing him that one might exist. Glen was not always soft about it. Richard recalled that he also imposed rules. He told his younger brothers not to miss school, not to spray paint walls, and not to make impulsive decisions they would later regret. Some of those memories drew laughter inside the cathedral because they sounded like the warnings of an exasperated parent. But beneath the humor was something serious. Glen accepted responsibility for people who were younger than him. He pushed his brothers when he believed they were capable of more. Richard said Glen could see what they might become, rather than only what they happened to be at that moment. Christy was too young to hear those stories inside the cathedral. One day, however, they may matter to him more than the public achievements attached to his father's name. He may learn that long before Glen became a father himself, he had already practiced some of fatherhood's less glamorous duties. He listened, he corrected, he encouraged, he stayed involved when it would have been easier to step away. That does not replace the years Christy has lost. No collection of family stories can recreate mornings, birthdays, or conversations that will never take place. But those stories can give a child something more personal than a public biography. They can show him how his father behaved when there was no audience. Near the end of his tribute, Richard repeated an idea Glen had once shared with the family. When someone dies, he said, the people left behind can inherit the best parts of that person. Richard believed the family had already begun receiving that inheritance. The conversations, the embraces, the strange humor, the sadness, the insight and the restless energy Glen had carried into their lives. For Christy, that inheritance will arrive slowly. A story from an uncle, a memory from his mother, a habit someone recognizes in him without warning, and through those moments, he may begin to know the man who was his father. The people sitting inside St. Patrick's Cathedral had not all known the same Glen Hansard. Some had met him when he was still playing small rooms in Dublin, carrying his guitar from one uncertain night to the next. Others had entered his life after audiences around the world learned his name. A few knew him mainly as a neighbor, a brother, or the man who called when someone needed help. For several hours, all of those lives occupied the same room. The members of the Frames were there. They had shared years that could not be reduced to successful records or crowded concerts. They remembered the rehearsals that went badly, the journeys that lasted too long, and the private language that develops between people who have made music together for decades. Markéta Irglova sat among them. Her history with Glen was familiar to the public, but the funeral did not ask anyone to revisit old romances or explain the changes in their relationship. She was there as someone who had created music with him and continued doing so long after their lives had taken different paths. When Markéta joined Eddie Vedder and Thomas Bartlett to perform The Song of Good Hope, the moment brought together people from separate periods of Glen's life. Eddie had crossed oceans to be there. He did not make the performance about himself. He stood beside musicians who knew the song and allowed Glen's words to carry the moment. Markéta's voice remained close and controlled. Nobody tried to turn the cathedral into a concert hall. The song was being returned to the family. Elsewhere in the church sat Hozier, Imelda May, Dermot Kennedy, Damien Dempsey, Lisa O'Neill, and other Irish musicians who had shared stages, conversations, or causes with Glen. Actors Steve Coogan and Chris O'Dowd were also among the mourners. The list of names was impressive, but fame was not what connected them that afternoon. They had come because Glen had entered their lives personally. Bono tried to describe that quality when he stood before the congregation. He said that people remembered the day they met Glen, even those gathered outside the cathedral, and some who had never met him felt as though they had lost a friend. It was an unusual thing to say about a man whose public performances could appear so intense. Away from the stage, friends repeatedly remembered someone who made room for other people. He introduced musicians to one another. He encouraged younger artists. He appeared at benefits without needing his name placed at the center of the poster. Those stories may one day become important to Christy. His father's public life can be found in films, recordings, and newspaper archives. The private Glen will depend on the people who were sitting inside that cathedral. One person may remember a meal. Another may remember a telephone call made late at night. Someone else may tell Christy about the moment his father noticed a frightened young musician standing alone and walked over to speak with them. No single person in the room possessed the entire story. Máire knew the husband who returned home. His brothers knew the older boy who had helped raise them. The Frames knew the band leader. Markéta knew the writing partner. Eddie knew the friend who understood what music could not always repair. Christy will grow up receiving those versions one by one, and perhaps, when they are placed together, they will allow him to see something close to the man in the photograph above the coffin. Not the performer facing a crowd, but the father looking toward his family. By the time Bono stood to speak, the funeral had already carried the congregation through several versions of grief. There had been quiet memories from Glen's family, songs performed by old friends, and moments when Máire had needed to stop before continuing. Bono did not pretend that another speech could explain the loss. He began with the person Glen had been among people. Bono said that those who met him remembered the occasion. Glen had a way of making people feel that the connection between them was personal, even when thousands of others believed the same thing. Bono joked that Glen seemed to have more than 100,000 best friends. The laughter inside the cathedral was brief, but welcome. Then Bono took out his phone. Earlier that morning, he had received a message from Patty Smith, who could not be present in Dublin. Rather than simply reading her words, he played the recording aloud. Her voice filled the cathedral with what was described as a lullaby for Glen's family and friends. It was an intimate sound coming from an ordinary phone. There was no elaborate introduction and no attempt to turn the moment into a performance. A woman who had known Glen was sending comfort from far away, and Bono was allowing the people closest to him to hear it together. For Máire, the message arrived during a service in which nearly every song carried a private association. For Christy, who was not inside the cathedral, it became another piece of the enormous farewell taking place around him. Bono then began reciting words from U2's Beautiful Day. He did not perform it in the familiar manner of a stadium concert. The words were spoken slowly, with the edge beside him. A song normally surrounded by lights, amplifiers, and thousands of voices was reduced to something quieter. The cathedral listened. Later, as the service approached its end, Liam O'Maionlai began Bob Dylan's Forever Young. Other musicians gradually joined him. Eddie Vedder, Bono, The Edge, Marketa Irglova, Damien Dempsey, Lisa O'Neill, and members of Glen's musical circle gathered their voices around the song. No single singer remained at the center. That felt appropriate for a farewell to someone repeatedly remembered for bringing people together. The choice of Forever Young did not need to be explained. Glen had died at 56, while his son was only 3. One life had stopped unexpectedly. The other had barely begun. As the musicians sang, Máire remained near the coffin that carried the family photographs. Christy was still somewhere away from the cameras and the crowded church, protected from a ceremony he could not yet understand. The final notes did not end the music. As Glen's wicker coffin was carried from the cathedral, Paddy Casey and Imelda May led The Auld Triangle, a song deeply connected with Dublin and one Glen had often performed himself. Voices followed the coffin toward the doors. Outside, the crowd waited. Some applauded. Others remained silent. Many held up their phones, but there were also people who simply watched as the procession passed. The public service was over. A private farewell would follow. For the thousands who had come to honor Glen, the songs offered a way to accompany him for a few final minutes. For his family, there was still the far more difficult task of returning to a home where the music could no longer bring him through the door. The heartbreaking truth about Glen Hansard's son was never a hidden scandal. It was the fact that Christy was 3 years old when his father died. He was too young to sit inside St. Patrick's Cathedral, too young to understand the speeches, and too young to know why a photograph of his family had been placed above Glen's coffin. Some memories may remain. A voice in the next room, a familiar coat, the feeling of being lifted into his father's arms. Others may fade before Christy is old enough to understand how precious they were. Máire will now carry the years he cannot remember. She will tell him how Glen looked at him, how fatherhood changed the rhythm of their home, and why so many people gathered in Dublin to say goodbye. During the funeral, Máire said that she and Glen had found truth and beauty in their son. Those words revealed what Christy had become in Glen's final years. He was not a late addition to a finished life. He was the person who had moved to the center of it. Christy will also inherit stories from his uncles, Glen's bandmates, and friends who knew him away from the stage. They can describe the man behind the songs, but none can replace the father who should have been there. One day, Christy may look at the photograph from the funeral and understand what everyone inside the cathedral already knew. He was not the son Glen left behind. He was the future Glen had only just begun to live for.